Good morning, everybody. Welcome again in another session. Mr. Rosolio, are you hearing me?
Yes, ma'am, I can hear you well.
Yes, you can start, please.
Good morning, everyone. Today I will be discussing about how to guide our project students in coming up with a substantive project report. I am Rosalio Pilupana from the Electronics and Telecommunications specialization here in the college, and I have been teaching in HCT for 10 years, and I have a prior experience of teaching from Ali College for around 6 years. So for 16 years, I have been guiding project students on how to come up with a report that is representative of their hard work, a report that is cohesive. So I will start my presentation by informing you that since I am a lecturer from the engineering department, my perspective is really on the engineering side. So in case you have some disparity somehow with your discipline, just bear with me. And at the end of this presentation, maybe you can collaborate with me so that I can enhance more this particular topic so that students can be benefited of our efforts in supervising them. So without further ado, this presentation is made out of three parts. The first part will be on the problems meet in supervising students. The second part is on the standards of project report writing. And the third part is the mitigation in addressing problems in report writing. What are the challenges that we've met in supervising project students? By the way, can you hear me? Can I see some reaction from
Yes, we can
the
hear you.
attendees? So continuing with this aspect, what are the challenges? Since this is an Arabic nation, so we already have that kind of thinking that English proficiency is really one of them. And in fact, if you agree with me, some of our project supervisors are calling us as project super advisors. They try to mix up being an advisor and a supervisor at the same time. So maybe what we have in mind is that we are advising them somehow of the project and supervising them at the same time. So from there, we can really detect that there is some kind of proficiency in English that needs to be developed by our students. And since report writing is in English, that is really the biggest challenge that we have as project supervisors. The second challenge is that we have multiple members in a group. In the engineering department, we have around five at maximum in a group. So imagine five different personalities, five different level of intellect, five different behavior. So trying to merge these five members in a group to a project is somehow a challenge. In fact, I don't know if you have experienced this. Maybe in those five members in the group, two or three are the ones working. The others are just like, partakers of the project, suppliers of somehow, if you need this, if you need that, then that is the only participation that they have. And if we continue to allow that kind of environment, then it defeats the purpose of coming up with a group project and inculcating in the minds of these members the importance of being able to work in a group, contributing a particular work in a project, and developing a written report, which is very much important. The third challenge that we have is on the knowledge of the perceived project. Based on my experience, some of our project students, what they usually do, they ask project supervisors, Mr. Miss, what project can you possibly give me? And if you say, okay, this is the title of the project, can you give me the schematic diagram? Can you give me this? We have to remember that this project is for our students to make. And if we allow again this kind of passing of knowledge from supervisor to students and students not learning by themselves, it is somehow effective, I should say, in trying to assimilate what is required from the final year project. Next, timeline and schedule. We are pretty sure that these students, what they usually do, they are cramming up at the end. So if the project is running for 3 months, in the first few weeks, what they usually do, they just say hi, hello. And at the end, that is the time that they are trying their best to squeeze out their time and resources so that they can finish up the project. And that is a big no-no. Because if that is the case, then there's a possibility that either the project is not working or the written report is compromised. So we have to make sure that the timeline of the schedule should be followed. Designing and testing. This is another big challenge because what the students usually do is that they wanted a project that challenging, and yet they do not know how that project has to be designed and has to be tested. So it goes back again to the supervisor. Mr. or Miss, could you possibly help me? Of course, the level best of the supervisor is just to give them the idea, not for the supervisor to finish the project for them. And the last part is writing a cohesive and substantive project report. Our issue here is that students, they are only thinking that this project, a hardware project, whatever project that they have, is the most important thing. They forgot to remember that a project report is really important because that hardware project or simulation project could only be seen for about months, but the project report can be seen for a lifetime. For as long as the written report is there, people can read your work. So these are the challenges that project students have in supervising them. So what are some of the errors or issues in project reports? Maybe you have some other issues or shortcomings from the students. You can also adapt that to me so that I can somehow come up with a comprehensive or more comprehensive notification or addressing of these issues of project reports writing. First one is chapter one, which is the introduction. And what I usually see is that when we talk about abstract, you can only see abstract written in 3 to 5 sentences. We can see the statement of the problem talking about their personal problem. Mr. I don't have time. Mr. I don't have these resources. Mr. Miss, these are my personal issues. Third one is when they came up with the statement of the problem, instead of writing them in a declarative manner, they contextualize it in terms of questions. Like, how can this project be beneficial to the community? How will it improve? Blah, 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 blah. A statement of the problem should be stated in a statement form. So if we talk about questions, we are actually referring to them as research questions, not the statement of the problem. objectives. This is where most of the students or the project reports are failing because they were not able to come up with a more specific, realistic, and measurable objective. That at the end of the 3 month or 4 month period of their final year in project, some of the objectives are not met. And when they came up with objectives also, instead that they have to be specific, for example, the project has something to do with turning on the fan when the temperature is very hot or very high. So instead of writing that when the temperature is reached at 37 degrees, the fan is on, that is specific, realistic, and measurable, this students or the project students wrote something like the if the temperature to make the room cool, to make the environment perhaps cooler, and so on and so forth. That is very much generic in nature. So it has to be specific and it has to meet the statement of the problem. And the scope and limitation is not realistically bounded. So what the students usually do in the written report, they just write whatever scope they have, whatever limitation they have. They forgot to understand that the scope and limitation is really the protection. Because from the scope and limitation, those readers will know, okay, this is only the boundaries of the project, nothing more, nothing less. That is for chapter one. If you have some more issues or concerns that you saw in project reports, you can add them up to me later on. I really would appreciate that. Chapter two in the literature review. Students were just writing anything that they wanted. They forgot that the literature review has something to do with the objectives of the project. They just presented it in whatever manner that they have. They also forgot that when you come up with a literature review, you have to tell a story so that when the reader reads your written report, the reader will be guided accordingly. Aha, this is what is expected from this chapter. And with so many literature that you have, you failed, or the written report failed to include a conclusion. Among this literature, what is the most important thing that is relevant to the project? And some written reports are written with only 2 or 3 related studies. In fact, most of the studies, it is very, I would say, a novel work, maybe. But since we're talking about final year and projects of the students, they can always gather more information because everything can be found in the internet. Citations and referencing are not integrated. So when you look at the literature review, it's bare. Just that writing there, writing here. And we know that when we talk about literature review, these are anchored against a report done by someone. These are not original ideas by the students. And because of that, they have to be cited. You have to give due credit for the work that you've copied from someone else's project. Methodology. The methodology is the third chapter. I'm just meaning it may be running in simulation, but it is not running in the hardware level. But if you try to, the students have to really understand these things. The project is really on the hardware level. So it has to be done at the hardware level. Simulation is just is just to make sure that when this hardware project is done, it will work. That is the most important part of simulating. So if the students would just come up with a simulation project, that is not really the holistic methodology that is required. And it fails to convince the readers of the method used to produce the output. Normally in engineering or IT related perhaps, we are dealing with the SDLC, the Systems Development and Life Cycle. From there, we will be able to come up with the complete methodology in coming up with the paper. So instead that these students will have to follow that systems development and life cycle, they just put anything that they thought of are anything that they thought of as important as part of methodology. Results. And this is very much heartening because, especially in the engineering projects, some of the projects are really good projects. But when you see the results, the project is running, completely running. But when you see the written report, you cannot see the importance of that project, the development of that project, and the output of that project. So in the written report, findings were not there. If they are there, they do not actually meet the objectives of the project. Second, discussion does not focus on the objectives of the project. So when we try to discuss about a particular output or a particular data that is gathered from project, they fail to focus on the objectives of the project. It also fails to represent the outputs of the project. This is what I said earlier. So what the students came up with is just a part and parcel of the actual project, but they for somehow failed to come up with the holistic presentation of the project. Holistic in the sense that every single output in terms of objectives are being addressed upon in the results. And it is not that they can just write anything that they wanted. Okay, for as long as the result is there, I will just have to write here and there. Lastly, conclusion and recommendation. In conclusion, we saw that students are just writing anything. It is not even relevant to the project. And conclusion is just written in 2 sentences. Conclusion is not logically arranged. Aside from the conclusion, recommendation does not also reflect the project. Recommendation does not provide the salient features of the project. Because when we recommend, of course, we are trying to sell the project, yeah, to the readers that this is the best. And these are the features that make them the best, and so on and so forth. Recommendation does not give suggestions on how the project could be improved. This is one important aspect of writing a recommendation, and students somehow forget to include it. So these are the issues and common errors that we saw from the project reports of our students. Uh, this is always missing. If not missing, if it's there, it's always erroneous references. Students will just come up with any reference at all. They even take references from Wikipedia, which we already knew is needing to be cited because anyone can write anything in Wikipedia. They're just writing anything from Google, from Yahoo, and so on and so forth. And these are not reliable sources, so to speak. Citation is also missing. They may have written references, but they forgot that the citation should be there. That is why you have references, because you have cited them from somebody's work. And this citation, if missing in the written report, it's just like if you are the reader and you wanted to get the information, exact information from somewhere, you'll find out that it's not there. And if I say the written report has 10 references and there's no citation, where are these references coming from? It's really hard to associate these references with respect to the contents of the written report. And when they reference or cite, they fail to follow the standard way of referencing and citation. So, all in all, these are the common sources of the errors and issues with respect to the written report. Therefore, what is our role as project supervisor? According to Nancy Klein, she said, supervision is an opportunity to bring someone back to their own mind to show them how good they can be. And that is our role. When we supervise our students, we have to bring them back to the essence of the project. Normally, based on the engineering way of practicing projects, we have this 1 week of consultation with them. And we also have this project diary. So in that project diary, we simply write what are the issues, the problems, and what are the solutions. So if we see that the students are not following the timeline that we have given them, this is our role. You have to get their attention and bring them to work. And they came up with something because students will always have a lot of excuses. We have to remind them that to come up with a report for the project as a whole needs dedication and effort. So that is the role of the project supervisors with respect to the final year project. What are the standards of project report? The abstract. So as I have already earlier mentioned, the abstract was just normally written in 3 to 5 sentences. But the abstract class, sorry, the abstract is simply a summary of the research paper or project report. It's just like you're watching a movie. This is just a trailer of the movie. If the abstract is written well, then it will try to get the attention of the readers, and the reader will continue to see what is inside the paper if the abstract is written properly. So, what are the contents of the abstract? It briefly presents the objectives and results of the paper to inform the readers of its contents. If you try to read between the lines, the abstract is focused on the objectives and the results. It is also called as the executive summary. In some other references, abstract is also known as executive summary. And this has to be written at the end when all the information is finalized. So you cannot simply come up with an abstract right at the beginning of your project. The abstract is a summary, and a summary would mean that you have all the details finalized and then write them in a form of an abstract. So the abstract has the following contents. It has to provide a brief introduction of the project. So if we talk about project that has something to do with maybe the greenhouse effect. When you say greenhouse, we try to make we create an environment where the temperature, humidity, and so on and so forth has to be controlled. So when we have abstract, we have to say something as an introduction to this greenhouse. And then after that, we have to write what are the objectives of this project? What are the methodologies so that we can get the results of the project based on the objectives of the project? And what are the findings? What will be the conclusion and what will be the recommendation? These are written briefly, meaning in a concise form, in a summarized form. So it is usually written up to 300 words or as it is required. Chapter 1. Chapter 1 usually is composed of the background of the project, the statement of the project, the objectives of the project, the scope and limitation, significance of the project, and the definition of terms. Background of the project. The background of the project is a narrative of the current scenarios or issues that serve as the motivating factors in conceptualizing the project. We had this proposal to TRC, has something to do with providing an automated public parking system in Oman. Because the thing is that the public parking spaces in Oman, some of them are actually for, I mean, you have to park in a particular place. You have to pay, I think, 100 paisa for 30 minutes. And looking at the scenario of how much the how much the government can collect from these people, how much will be generated, and how can we control these parking spaces with respect to drivers parking in different places. This was this actually served as the motivation of coming up with the project. When we saw that in some public places where parking is or has to be paid, we noticed that some of them actually escaped from paying. That somebody, I think delegated from the ministry, has to check whether this particular car has paid or not paid. But if that person has not come right on time and you were able to escape out, then you're not able to pay. So these are the motivating factors, and this has to be written in the background of the project. And from there, it includes a review of the existing literature of the research leading up to the project. So we try to search what are things available in Muscat per se. What are the methods or the systems of parking in Oman? Like if we go to the airport, if we go to other places, you notice that they are making use of boom gates, they're making use of RFID cards, and so on and so forth. So these things, we incorporate them in the background of the project. And from there, we'll be able to see if there is a gap that needs to be identified, if there is an area that needs to be addressed. And what we saw from the literature is that boom gates, humps are required, and RFIDs are required. So from there, we found out that these are requiring a lot of materials, a lot of components. So because of that thing, we were able to come up with something that will replace these things. Next, how the study will address these gaps and how it will contribute to the existing knowledge in the field. This will be explained here. So in the background itself, you will see what is there using humps, what is there using parking attendants. It's more about expenses. you're paying more expenses, you're paying more maintenance, and so on and so forth. I'm actually talking about the same proposal that we submitted to TRC. And if that information that you actually took from somewhere, and of course that somewhere could be from the internet or from the books, then proper citation should be in place. So of course, from our studies, we saw a lot from the internet, from other books, and we saw news articles from Times of Oman, and we incorporated all of them. Statement of the problem. It addresses the problem that the project attempts to provide a solution. So after reviewing the different parking systems in Oman, we saw that there is something that we can improve on, and that will serve as an alternative solution to the problem. So here in the statement of the problem, we have to clearly identify what we wanted to come up, what we wanted to troubleshoot, what we wanted to solve. And in that case, we wanted to eliminate the other factors that for us could be simplified. And from there, we will be able to save some amount of money and maintenance will be minimized and parking attendants could be resorted to working as technicians perhaps when the system will be implemented. It should clearly contextualize the problem and issues stated in a declarative manner, which is what I said earlier. Some of the students, when they wrote the statement of the problem, they're asking questions. Are these beneficial? Are these blah, blah, blah? It should be written in a declarative manner because it is a statement of the problem. Or else you're referring to research questions when the sentences are written in interrogative manner. It must serve as the basis of the objectives of the project. So we found out that in that particular parking system, we noticed that people or drivers in general will have to pay using um, Momentel or Urido, the telecommunications company, or they can drop a coin per, 100 paisa perhaps, because they also have this public meter standalone, but some of them are really not working. And I have not seen any standalone meter working. So usually what the drivers do is to send payment through SMS to this telecommunications company. So we wanted to simplify the procedure. And we stated that in the problem that due to this boom gates, due to this park attendance, due to this not functional park meters, we have to come up with a solution so that collection of money will be strengthened, so that the money that the government can generate from these parking spaces will be maximized. And from there, we anchored our objectives of the project. What are the objectives of the project? They have to follow the SMART ideology. It has to be specific, not general. It has to be measurable. It has to be achievable. It has to be realistic and time bounded. That is SMART. And most of the project reports that are done by our students, either they are not realistic or not time bound or not measurable, or maybe sometimes not specific. But these five elements of a smart ideology should be followed in coming up with the objectives of the project. So we need to make sure that once we come up with a project, it has to be specific. In our case, with respect to that automated public parking metering system. That is the title of the project, automated public metering, automated paid public metering system. We wrote objectives to be specific. We wrote something that will answer the statement of the problem. So one of them, if I'm not mistaken, is to use a camera. Actually, instead of using these boom gates, park attendants, and so on and so forth, we will replace them all by smart cameras. So we specifically write there what are the objectives of the project. One, we have to make use of a camera that will take the plate number. Another one, we have another camera that will take the positions or that will identify if the cars are available in parking slots and so on and so forth. And then we also have specify that there will be a linkage between the system that will be coming up with the details of the car, because if that particular car has not paid, then it has to be penalized. So we'll be able to detect that. So those are specific things, measurable, right objectives that can be quantified, like output parameters, for example, voltage, current, power, distance, area, volume, and its statistical data. It has to be measured because when you come up with the results, you have to quantify the objectives and bring out the value in terms of numbers. So in our case, going back to that project, we wanted to come up with a camera that will be able to detect if there is a car in the parking space, and another camera that will be able to get the plate number of that car. So these are measurable, measurable in the sense that at the end, we will be able to quantify if the system will be able to identify if there is a car in a particular slot, by how much, maybe by 90%, by 80%, or by 100%. And if we talk about getting the plate number, are we accurate in terms of what? In terms of percentage? Could be accurate in terms of 90% or 80%. So these objectives have to be measurable and they have to be achievable. So if you think, especially in the perspective of the students, if the project could not be done in 3 months' time or 4 months' time, then the objectives have to be rephrased so that the objectives of the project will be met. So in our case, we actually came up with an idea of accomplishing it within 2 years. Realistic. This is letter R of the SMART ideology. Informing objectives, resources, and technical capabilities will have to be considered. This is the most important thing because what the students are doing, they just come up with an idea, but they don't know how to perhaps simulate. They don't know the software and they don't want to study. They don't want to get help from someone to teach them how to come up with a simulation or programming on a particular output. So if the project requires software, device, instrument, or programming skills that are not available, then again, you have to rephrase the objectives so that it should be realistic. Are you capable of doing it or not? If not, then the objectives of the project will have to be coined in such a way that you have everything that you need to meet the objectives of the project. It has to be time bound, meaning the project has to be done in a specific time. Just like being achievable, you have to consider if these objectives can be done in a particular time. Are these achievable within this particular time? So again, we go back to our proposal. We thought of realistic as coming up with programming skills. So what we wanted to do is to learn the programming skills required so that we will be able to run the project. Because if we don't have the required programming skills, then we cannot run the project. We cannot produce the output. And we also need not only the programming skills, we have to identify which smart camera are we going to use, how are we going to mount them, and so on and so forth. And limitation. As I've said earlier, the scope and limitation will serve as boundary of the student's project. This is really important. Scope is a problem or issue that the researcher wants to study with the project. So if you try to see scope and objectives, they are very much similar. That is why once the students will come up with the objectives of the project, this has not, I mean, the objectives of the project should not be stated again in the scope. So if you think that part of the project is within this particular scope, then you can write it there. That is why some written reports would say, okay, the objectives are the same with the scope. I will not write any scope at all. I will just have to write the limitation of the project. So here, it is an additional contextual presentation on what has to be covered in the project, which is not mentioned in the objectives. For example, we talk objectives of the project has something to do with being specific, maybe at the hardware level, on the object in the scope. We can probably talk about, for example, on the smart, I mean, automated public paid parking system, metering system. The scope that we have is that the project has to be within the area of Muscat. That is part of the scope, and that is not part of the objectives of the project. Limitation. Limitation is used to put boundaries on what would not be covered within the project. So if students will come up with written report, they have to ensure that they know what is the limitation of the project, because this will also serve our students a guideline on how the project has to be presented and how the project has to be outputted. It presents constraints that affect the reader's ability to study the scope of the project effectively. So, for example, since it was only a proposal, the same project proposal that I'm referring to that was sent to TRC, what could be the possible limitation? We don't have snow, so we cannot detect whether the camera is capable of getting the presence or detecting the presence of a car or getting the plate number of a car, because Oman doesn't have snow. And maybe we talked about heavy rains. Sometimes it does, but most of the time it is not. So when we talk about heavy rains, this could also be one of the limitations that the camera is not capable of detecting, and so on and so forth. Significance of the project. Significance would mean what is the benefit of the project to the community. So it is to illustrate the contribution that the project study will make to the existing literature on the problem or broad problem areas in a certain community. Generally, a component of the significance of the study is to present exactly how the current literature is extended or how our project can be beneficial. It determines who benefits from the study and how that specific audience will benefit from its findings. What contribution will the project make to the literature or to the field? What can be learned from the study and who benefits about the project or study? So this is the significance, the advantages, the benefits that the project will have to offer not only to a community, but to the readers themselves. Definition of terms. This is the last part of chapter one, and it is operationally defined. So there are terms that are usually used in different perspective. You have to define them as to how you use these particular words in the report. Terms are defined to avoid ambiguous meaning, which can be otherwise interpreted in different ways. They are arranged in an alphabetical manner. An acronym should always be spelled out fully, especially if it is used for the first time and not commonly known. Make sure to define, though common may be, you have the special meaning or used differently. And complicated and lengthy definitions should be included in the appendix. So, what are the examples? Sometimes we make use of the word minute, and minute could be in terms of time, but it could also have another same spelling but different meaning. Minute, minute has something to do with size. So if you have some kind of words that are often used by layman terms but are used differently or operationally in the project report on the project itself, then it has to be defined accordingly. Like, for example, read and write. You know that for layman's terms, read meaning you have to read words, write meaning you have to write letters or characters. But in computer or IT related, when you say read, you're capable of displaying something, and write is modifying something. So these terms will have to be defined operationally. They're also because some written reports are fond of using acronyms. So if we have to write acronyms, we have to also make sure that we define or we write the acronym itself, the full name of that acronym. Abbreviation, for example, when you say DAC, that could mean digital to analog converter, but it could also mean data acquisition. HD would mean high definition, but it could also mean home defense. So if you are using these terms, you have to define them accordingly. Review of related literature. It is a survey of scholarly sources on a specific topic. It provides an overview of current knowledge, allowing the researcher or project students to identify relevant theories, methods, and gaps in the existing research work. And with the proposal that we made, we came up with around 40 or 50 literature reviews. All of them have met the objectives of the project. All of them will help us figure out what is the best way of implementing cameras to detect spaces, to detect plate numbers. There are five key elements to writing a review or literature review. It has to have a search for relevant literature, evaluate sources, or we're running out of time, identify themes, debates, and gaps, outline the structure, and write the literature review. So here we have to make a story. What is the story all about? So that once the reader will be able to see what is there in the review of the written literature, the reader will know, this is what the paper is all about. This is how the paper is presented. It will serve as a guide to the readers on how the reader can follow the concepts within the review of written literature. Methodology. It explains how the project or research work is done, allowing readers to evaluate the reliability and validity of the work, and this should be generally written in past tense. It should consist of the following. You have to explain the methodological approach, describe the methods of data collection or selection, describe the methods of analysis, and evaluate and justify the methodological choices. So these are simply in the engineering perspective. Methodology has something to do with the systems development and life cycle. SDLC. And results. This presents the findings of the study based on methodology or methodologies applied to gather information. It should state the findings of the research arranged in logical sequence without bias or interpretation. So in other words, if you have the output, present the output as it is without putting any color, any bias, or without interpreting it. Present the report as it is. If the voltage required is 10 volts and you get 9.5 volts perhaps, then it has to be 9.5 without bias or without interpretation. Because a project doesn't mean it has to be perfect. It means that it has to be qualified and quantified in such a way that that particular idea or project will be somehow improved because there's no such thing as perfection. So, introductory context for understanding the results by restating the research problem underpinning the project. Inclusion of non-textual elements such as figures, charts, photos, maps, tables to illustrate key findings appropriate. A systematic description of the results, highlighting the observations that are most relevant to the topic under investigation. The page length of the results section is guided by the amount and types of the data to be reported, and a short paragraph that includes the results section by synthesizing the key findings of the study is included. Conclusion and recommendation. These may be combined or in long reports presented in separate sections. If there are no recommendations, then conclusions would be fine. Conclusions sum up the key points of the discussion, the essential features of the design, or the significant outcomes of the investigation. The conclusions have to be related to the objectives of the project. As its function is to round off the story of the project, it should be written to relate directly to the objectives of the project or the aims of the project as stated in the introduction or chapter 1. Indicate the extent to which the objectives have been achieved, summarize the key findings, outcomes or information in the report, acknowledge limitations and make recommendations for future work where applicable, and highlight the significance and usefulness of the project. References indicate where the work or information is taken from, and there are a variety of ways to write references, such as the APA style, MLA style, IEEE, Chicago style, Harvard, and so on and so forth. They are written at the end of the paper. Appendix. It is part of the research paper that contains materials and references that may be detailed or too big to include in the actual report. These materials can be, but are not limited to, calculations, technical drawings, graphs, raw data, data specifications in the field of electronics, and the content in the appendix needs to be summarized and then referred to from the main part of the research paper. It has to be labeled with letter, title, or number. These numbers and titles need to be listed in the contents page of the research paper. Sorry, because we're running out of time. Citation, this is really important. If some words or phrases that are used come from other sub websites or books, let the readers know what kind of sources are used, who created the source, and when the source was created. It is simply giving credit to the authors of the source that are used in the paper. So what are the paraphrasing websites that are available? You have Content Professor, Free Spinner, and so on and so forth. Okay. So this time, it is really not difficult that if you have an idea, you take that idea and then put that in that website, and the website will just paraphrase it for you. But we have to really understand if that paraphrased statement or statement or ideas are really the one that you wanted to convey. Because sometimes I experienced that. Sometimes it was written in a different manner. Tourism, and this is really killing all the written reports. If your project is plagiarized, it's just like a trash work. So it has to present someone else's work or ideas as your own with or without their consent by incorporating it into your work without full acknowledgement. That is plagiarizing. All published and unpublished material, whether in manuscript, printed, or electronic form, is covered under this definition. It could be intentional, reckless, or unintentional. And this could mean that if you are plagiarizing something, it has to go through a disciplinary offense. And I think in the college, if you have done this for a couple of times, I'm not quite sure, students will have to be expelled. So these are the websites. Some of them are free, some of them are limited into using 1,000 words. So what we usually do before we send it to turn it in, we just cut the written report into 1,000 words and then put them there and combine all of them to see whether plagiarism is high or low according to the standards set by the university. So how to make the report cohesive and substantive? It all boils down to a very good statement of the project. The statement of the project is the most essential part of the written report. What is the problem? How do you solve the problem? And how can you solve the problem within the objectives of the project? And for me, if the objectives of the project are clear, then students can be guided accordingly. All of these objectives are always the basis of literature review, methodology, results, conclusion, and recommendation. They all boil down to the objectives of the project. That is how important the objectives of the projects are. How to make the report cohesive and substantive? Assign a leader chosen by the members of the group. Let the leader delegate work among project group members, and if all the members of the group are tasked to write a certain part of the project report, assign a student who knows how to tone down the report. Yes, ma'am. In this way, the report can be read as an individual work or as a group work. Sorry, because I took so much time. These are the references, and that's the end of my presentation. Sorry, but I think I just got around 3 minutes more for the one
Thank
hour
you.
allotted to
Thank you,
me.
sir. Thanks for this session. It's really informative. And if you have any question, please ask. We have a 5 minutes.
And also, if you have the same concerns or ideas, maybe you can send them to me so that we can work it out
Yes,
and then
sure.
address these issues.
Actually, yes, actually, this presentation with also with the video will be uploaded in the training page. So there also they can keep their comments if they have any doubt. And somebody has any question here? Maybe nobody. Anyway, thank you again, sir. Thanks everybody.
Thank you, Mom, and thank you, everyone, for bearing with me. Thank you very much for your time.
Have
Thank
a
you, Mom.
nice day.
Thank you, Mom.
Have a nice weekend.